Edition. I'm Ken Rice. The war against opioid abuse continues on different legal fronts, from the state to the federal level. Across the country, government prosecutors are trying a new legal strategy to hold pharmaceutical companies liable for illegally hooking citizens in their states on OxyContin and other addictive drugs. As Omar Villafranca reports, a lawsuit filed by Oklahoma's Attorney General was the first in a series of similar legal actions.
Emily Walden's son, TJ, served his country in the Kentucky National Guard. He was also addicted to opioids and tried to get clean.
I did everything from following him to drug testing him. I put $11,000 on a credit card to put him into treatment. And he wanted to get better.
In 2012, TJ died after overdosing on oxymorphone. He was only 21.
Opioids take a hold of you, and it's extremely hard for people to overcome that.
Emily and thousands of other families are now watching closely as the opioid crisis is on trial in Oklahoma in a case that could affect more than 1,800 other pending lawsuits.
The worst man-made public health crisis in the history of our country.
In 2017, Oklahoma Attorney General Mike Hunter filed lawsuits against several pharmaceutical companies, accusing them of executing massive and unprecedented marketing campaigns, misrepresenting the risks of addiction, and making billions of dollars in profit.
Money can make people and businesses do bad things, very bad things. And that is why I'm here today.
Drug companies Purdue and Teva both settled with the state out of court, admitting no liability. Johnson & Johnson and their subsidiary Janssen are accused in the lawsuit of creating a public nuisance. During the height of the opioid epidemic, more than 500 Oklahomans died from overdoses a year. In a statement, Johnson & Johnson pointed out that their products in Oklahoma were clearly labeled and that they were designed to prevent abuse. Their subsidiary, Janssen Pharmaceuticals, called the state's allegations baseless and unsubstantiated.
The state's attorney says that at one point there were enough prescriptions to provide every adult here in Cleveland County with 135 pills. This trial is expected to last around 2 months. Omar Villafranca, CBS News, Norman, Oklahoma.
Pennsylvania's Attorney General Josh Shapiro quickly followed suit, charging Purdue Pharmaceuticals with violating the state's unfair practices and consumer protection laws, flooding the market through drug company reps or retailers to push OxyContin without sufficiently warning about the addictive consequences. This morning on the KDPG Sunday Edition, what the federal government is doing in its own fight against opioid abuse. We welcome back to the program the United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania, Scott Brady, appointed to the position by President Trump. Joe Smito, editorial writer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joins me for our discussion. Joe, always nice to have you along. Mr. Brady, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Ken.
How does what the states, individual states are doing, such as Oklahoma, how does that fit in with what the federal government is doing and the approach you and your office and your fellow U.S. attorneys around the country are doing to fight the opioid epidemic?
I think when we look at the opioid epidemic, we're talking about a crisis on a scope and a scale that we have not encountered before. As we all aware, and especially in Pennsylvania, which is really ground zero of the epidemic, we combine the highest per capita rates of overdose death with the highest sheer number of overdose deaths. Really, Western Pennsylvania and Southern Ohio are probably the epicenters of this epidemic. It was clear when I entered office in the beginning of 2018 that we needed a new strategy. So in the 4 years leading up to my appointment from 2013 to 2017, we had seen a 208% increase in overdose deaths in Western Pennsylvania alone. And so what we had to define was, how do we attack this with a new urgency? How do we attack this epidemic with all the tools in our toolbox? And how do we attack it on all fronts? And to your question, Ken, that's where the combined efforts of the state attorney general, of our local DAs, and the Department of Justice dovetail. Because what we realized was that we had to continue to attack aggressively drug trafficking organizations, and the federal government, the Department of Justice, brings resources that allow us to investigate those when they are across state lines and then coming from Mexico or China, so when there's international drug trafficking going on. And then we also have the dark web, which I know we're going to talk more about, and online marketplaces that sell fentanyl and carfentanil and opioids. And then where Josh and the other attorneys general efforts complements ours is on the diversion front. And so one of the most significant ways the epidemic exploded in our region was because of the diversion of prescription opioids. And so what the Department of Justice did was identify doctors who are running pill mills and pharmaceutical companies that are engaging in deceptive or possibly criminal practices, and attack them, investigate them aggressively with all of those same tools.
So are you doing something different than your predecessor, David Hickton, did? Because he was very aggressive on opioids, made it a very big priority.
Well, I think what we did was, again, just recognizing the sheer scope of it, was bringing a new urgency to this. So in our first year, in 2018, we increased the number of drug prosecutions by 42% over 2016. And again, using all the tools in our arsenal means that we have mandatories under federal law that our state counterparts don't have. And those are incredibly important tools when you need to work your way up a drug trafficking organization to not only take down the people in Pennsylvania, but their suppliers, be they in New York or Newark, or again, going back to California and cartels. And so we use those aggressively.
In March, I think you reported some statistics that showed some ground that you had gained. Could you talk about that success a little bit and how it came about?
Yes, absolutely. So in March, we announced the results of the overdose, kind of a snapshot in time of what was happening with overdoses here in Pennsylvania, or in Western Pennsylvania. And again, not solely because of the efforts of my office and the Department of Justice, but I think a large factor. We saw a decrease of 42% in overdose deaths in Western Pennsylvania. So my district is the 25 counties of Western Pennsylvania, basically from Altoona west. We have 4 million residents in the Western.
And up to Erie.
Up to Erie, down to Greene County, Fayette County. We have 4 million residents. So in the entire district, the western third of the state, we saw a 42% decrease. And in the southwest, Joe, to your point specifically, we saw a 48% decrease in Allegheny County, 50 in Butler, Beaver, so a significant success.
And some of that is the increased use of Narcan, naloxone, right? So you may have higher numbers or steadier numbers of people overdosing, but more people are surviving.
That's absolutely right. The importance of Narcan and having Narcan available to EMTs and fire departments and responding police can't be overstated. I mean, they are saving lives on a daily basis. So that's a piece of the picture, but our efforts are also significant.
Back in March, you said supply and demand. You were hitting on supply and demand.
That's right. So if you look at a problem comprehensively, or even as an economic solution, you have a supply side and a demand side. Our partners in the medical community, our partners in the treatment community are addressing the demand side. And if the demand side doesn't change, doesn't matter how aggressively you attack the supply side, they will still find ways to feed their addictions. But what we do as prosecutors is we attack supply. And so we wanted to attack it, again, on all fronts: dark web, drug trafficking organizations, doctors, and diversion efforts.
Your counterpart in Philadelphia, the U.S. attorney there, prosecuted a young woman, not a dealer, but she was a young addict who shared heroin with a friend who then died. That young woman is now facing 20 years in prison. Some say that's way too aggressive and enforcement of a law that was designed to go after dealers. But here it's being used against a friend who inadvertently, I assume inadvertently, shared a heroin that maybe her friend didn't know how potent it was.
I don't know the details of that case, so I don't want to speak to...
Has that type of prosecution been done here?
We typically don't prosecute users. We don't prosecute addicts. We are going after the leaders of drug trafficking organizations. Now, sometimes in overdose investigations, we start with the crime scene, and local police or the state police will engage the family of the overdose victim, people who may have shared and, again, inadvertently caused an overdose death. And with their help, with their assistance, then we can find out who supplied that person. And then we go after those people aggressively so that we can work our way into the organization.
You have a couple of units that I wanted to ask you about. One deals with fraud, and one deals with sort of the online or cyber aspects of combating opioids. How has each of those units contributed to some of the work that you're doing?
So with our kind of new strategy and new urgency, the Department of Justice has given us additional resources and tools in the last 2 years to combat the epidemic. One of those, as you mentioned, Joe, is the Opioid Fraud and Abuse Detection Unit, OFADU, which is a terrible acronym, but what it does is it provides additional prosecutorial resources to attack diversion, and specifically doctors who are running pill mills. And let me just say, broadly, 99% of the medical community is prescribing responsibly. Those are not the people we are going after. The medical community is self-policing. They're educating new generations of doctors and pharmacists to do this the right way. And they've been fantastic partners at Pitt and Duquesne and other schools. What we are doing is we're targeting the people who are truly running pill mills. It's cash for pills. There's no treatment. There's no follow-up. They don't really care, and they're just using their lab coat to exploit the addiction of people who are addicted for pure profit. That's who we're targeting. Since 2017, we've prosecuted more doctors and medical professionals in this program than any other district in the United States. And then the dark web is another front on this war, as it were, where we're going after, with our cyber expertise in our office and in the FBI, dark web marketplaces that are selling fentanyl, carfentanil, and opioids.
Let me, before we get into a deeper discussion of that, let me come back to something you said earlier. Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania is specifically ground zero for the opioid crisis. I know you've only been in this job for a year and a half. In that time, what conclusion have you reached as to why? Why this area? Because it's bad in Oklahoma, where they're suing, right? It's bad in Ohio, where there's a big case in Cleveland. It's bad in New Hampshire. We've heard about it many places, but you're saying we're even worse here. Why?
We are. In terms of, again, the number of overdose deaths and the per capita rates, we are. One is a function of population. We're bigger than West Virginia. We're bigger than Kentucky. But I think it's a combination of an aging population, and again, it's known that 2/3 of people who ultimately become addicted to opioids started with prescription pain medication. And so you have a combination of doctors who are not fulfilling their oaths to their patients, who are exploiting addiction for pure profit. You have what, as the Department of Justice and the Attorney General is investigating, pharmaceutical companies who are maybe improperly using aggressive marketing techniques.
But not just here.
Not just here. That's absolutely true.
So what is it besides our aging population, just to pin you down, what is it about this region that has made this such a fertile ground for this crisis? We're bigger than Kentucky, we're bigger than other areas, but we're smaller than Philly, we're smaller than Detroit, we're smaller than New York or Chicago.
It's really hard to pinpoint, right? But as I go around to different counties and talk to people, my family's from the Mon Valley, but I grew up in Mercer County, and a woman that I went to high school with, Melinda Redfoot, was injured, was prescribed pain medication, and ultimately sadly died and left 2 young children to be raised by her husband. Those of us who grew up in this area have seen a generation of economic disenfranchisement, and one wonders if a certain despondency, if a certain malaise, to quote President Carter, has affected our regions, and maybe not having some of the intermediating institutions and that had the vibrancy 20 years ago, churches and Rotary clubs and groups like that, kind of find people unmoored from their communities, and maybe that has something to do with the acceleration of addiction.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Okay, when the KDPG Sunday edition continues, more with U.S. Attorney Scott Brady on another battle his office is waging. We've hinted about it, cybercrime, the role of foreign governments and agents, and could there be a tie between cybercrime and the opioid crisis? We'll be right back.